Salutations, and welcome to part 2 of our full analysis of the Halo Reach beta. In the last part, I covered both the main menu as well as the weapons sandbox. This installment will cover just about everything else, from the vehicles, to maps, to assassinations, to armor abilities, and even some more cut content. However, before we get started with part 2, I have to go over two things from the previous part that I'd like to rectify. I briefly talked about the weapon recoil that the Halo Reach beta applied to every weapon in the game, and I said how this would have added another layer of randomness to Reach had it made it to the retail build. I was wrong for saying this. I shouldn't have used the word randomness, as vertical recoil by itself is pretty easy to predict and control. What I should have said was that this vertical recoil would have made it much more frustrating to control the many weapons in Reach that have a sizable amount of bloom applied to it, such as the DMR, needle rifle, assault rifle, etc. Another thing that I have absolutely no idea how I missed was the Elite's first person animations for the plasma pistol. In the beta, the Elites hold this weapon with two hands in first person, despite holding it with only one hand in third person. This was rectified in the final game, where the Elite now holds it in one hand in both first and third person. So with these two things cleared up, let's begin part 2. The concept of loadouts and armor abilities is a divisive topic in the Halo community. Players from either the competitive side of Halo or original trilogy purists in general find these additions to be detrimental to Halo's core gameplay due to the degree of randomness that each available loadout can provide, so there's no real equal starts, while the armor abilities themselves slow the game's pacing considerably. However, fans of Halo Reach find that these new additions to the sandbox will be just fine, and that they allow Halo Reach to stand out from the rest of the series in its own unique way. The differing loadouts provide players with a variety of tools that fit their playstyle, and the usage of armor abilities really allowed Halo Reach to demonstrate the combat potential that the Spartan 3s had. Whatever your opinion on loadouts and armor abilities may be, the Halo Reach beta was a perfect place to test these new mechanics out, and they have their fair share of changes from this build to the retail product. Switching between loadouts in the beta looks visually janky compared to the final game, where the transition between each loadout is much smoother. One major loadout feature that was cut from the final game, but still has functionality in the beta files, was the ability to have players automatically spawn in vehicles. In the beta map files loadout globals, there's a drop-down box for the loadout settings that offered a vehicle selection, and once the map is loaded up, the player will automatically spawn inside the vehicle of their choosing. It's a shame that this got scrapped, as it would have brought so much more untapped potential to Reach's custom games. Moving on to armor abilities, when activating an armor ability in the final game, there's a small activation sound effect that plays when attempting to use an ability. This sound effect is still in the beta, but can only be heard in third person. Armor abilities also lack the glowing equipment icons that their final game counterparts have. The pickup sound effect for the armor abilities is different between the two builds as well. Two armor abilities are missing in the beta, which are the drop shield and hologram. Let's start with Sprint, which was only usable by Spartans through normal means. Sprint's first person animation is a bit glitchy and appears to be missing some keyframes that would make the transition between walking and sprinting more smooth. The huffing and puffing that the Spartan uses for Sprint are also quieter in the beta. Armor lock remains mostly the same as it does in pre-title update Reach, but the melee reflection damage is a lot stronger in the beta than it is in the final game. When a player melees an armor-locked enemy, the damage the attacker takes is 70 EMP damage, completely breaking the player's shields. In the final game, this has been significantly nerfed to only dish out 14 points of EMP damage. Active camo is a lot more effective in the beta. While the camo still breaks when walking at full speed, it hides the player much more than it does in the final game, where the player is much more visible at full speed. The last armor ability that I want to talk about in terms of noticeable differences is Jetpack. Jetpack doesn't have any sort of gameplay altering changes from beta to retail, but the changes it does have are quite subtle. When using Jetpack in the final game, the player's screen will slightly shake during prolonged use. This does not happen in the beta variant, with the screen remaining perfectly still. This next change can't be visually demonstrated, but the use of controller rumble while using the jetpack is much more pronounced and noticeable in the final game than it is in the beta. I'm going to go on a very small tangent, but between these two clips, we can see another small change. There's a first person animation that plays in the final game when the player takes a decent amount of fall damage, however this does not exist in the beta just yet. In the Xbox Live session of this build, there are a few armor abilities and species combinations that went unused. The Spartans never had a chance to use evade, and the elites couldn't use sprint and armor lock. With the power of modding, we can modify the loadouts to have these characters spawn with abilities they originally didn't have public access to. When a Spartan uses evade, the most immediately noticeable difference is that the Spartan is making elite sounds. This is due to a lack of evade sound effects of the Spartans. The same in reverse happens for the elite that uses sprint. The animation for Spartans using evade appears to be slightly bugged in first person, and there's a reason for this. In third person, the animation depicts a Spartan making a long vaulting motion that goes unused in the retail build. One of the weirdest aspects of Spartan evade, however, is its interaction with obstacles. If a Spartan evades into an obstructed path, the top half of the body will be left behind, but the bottom half will clip through the obstruction and complete the animation before it teleports back to the player. From another player's perspective, it appears as if the entire Spartan model is clipping through the barricade to complete the animation. Enemy players can also shoot and even kill the biped as it's performing the glitch, and the dead body will teleport back to the original location once the player is killed. Elites, on the other hand, simply use a faster version of the walking animation when sprinting. However, my favorite discovery revolving around unused armor ability combinations is Elite Armor Lock. The invincibility effect in the beta is a distinctive, and in my opinion a much more intimidating, red color. In the final game, however, Elite Armor Lock just uses the same effects that a Spartan's Armor Lock would make. Vehicles in Halo Reach look to the series' beginnings for inspiration. In Halo Combat Evolved's campaign, the Covenant vehicles use a traditional health system that caused the vehicles to explode when the HP hits 0, and unlike the vehicles in Halos 2 and 3, the damage wasn't transferred to the driver, but instead went straight to the vehicle's health. This means that the vehicles in Halo Reach could be brought down by just about any weapon, even by small arms fire from the DMR and assault rifle. The beta, however, experimented with a new anti-vehicle mechanic that would eventually be cut from the final game. If a vehicle catches fire, it'll start to issue an alarm that its health is in critical condition. In this state, the vehicle's health is bleeding, and once it hits 0, it will spontaneously explode. This feature was cut from the final game to give vehicles a small boost in survivability. There are 5 vehicles that are used through normal means, and these include the Chain Gun Warthog, the Ghost, the Banshee, the Wraith, and finally the Scorpion. Let's start with the iconic Chain Gun Warthog. It was surprisingly disadvantaged in this beta not just compared to the final version, but to just about any version seen in the Halo series. In the beta, the initial rate of fire is 3 rounds per second, and it takes 2.5 seconds for the weapon to reach its maximum rate of fire of 15 rounds per second. In the final game, the initial rate of fire is 5 rounds per second, and it only takes 1 second to reach the 15 rounds per second maximum. The vehicle boosting for the Ghost, Banshee, and the Wraith behaved much like their Halo 2 and 3 counterparts. The boost for the Ghost and Banshee was limitless in the beta, and for the Wraith, it propelled itself with a single boost that the player couldn't control the propulsion output of. In the final game, each of these vehicles received a visual meter much like the ones used for the armor abilities. For the Ghost and Banshee, the boosts were no longer infinite. It will stop once a meter hits 0 and has to recharge. The Wraith actually benefited from this change, however, as its boost meter allowed it to propel itself further distances than before. Going back to the Banshee for a bit, when flipping with the Banshee, the camera zooms way further back than it does in the final game. The last big difference with the available vehicles comes from the massive amounts of vertical recoil that both the Wraith mortar and the Scorpion main cannon produce when firing. Luckily, this was removed from the final versions of these vehicles in favor of a more stable firing sequence. The following vehicles are still in the map files but went unused during the Xbox Live test and can only be accessed through modding, or at least most of them. The Plasma Cannon is technically unused content, but on Boneyard when playing Invasion, it can be picked up by shooting the side of the Phantom with an explosive weapon where the broken turret will fall to the ground. However, when it comes to the stationary version of this weapon, it is indeed unused content. In the beta, the Plasma Cannon uses a greenish tint on the shell, which was changed to a more traditional blue later on. The stationary turret also lacked enter and exit sound effects. Lastly, an interesting quirk regarding the torn off variant of the plasma cannon is that it overheats after prolonged use, even though there's no visible heat gauge anywhere in the HUD or on the weapon itself. The weapon no longer overheats in the final game. Now for the completely unused vehicles. First is the Mongoose. It's essentially the same as in the final game, but with the only difference being its camera placement. It's placed slightly higher than it is in the retail product. The Mongoose also can't be hijacked in this build, much like the Halo 3 variant. The remaining vehicles are Warthog variants. Let's start with the Goshawk. Immediately you'll notice the incomplete animations that both Spartans and Elites use for the turret. The targeting reticle is similar to those used for the Halo 2 and 3 variants of the Goshawk, whereas the final version has its own reticle that has meters for timing the fire recovery between shots. Lastly, the red reticle range on the beta Gauss turret is much lower than that used for the retail variant. In the beta, it reaches 25 world units, and in the final game, it increases to 60 world units, more than double of the original value. Next is the Rocket Hog. Like the Gauss turret, the Spartan and Elite animations are incomplete. The targeting reticle is similar to the final versions, but it went through a few alterations between builds. In the beta, it's slightly larger, and it's consistently blinking for whatever reason. In the final game, the crosshair was made a bit smaller, it no longer blinks, and 2 lines of dots that are meant to represent new rockets being loaded into the 2 launchers have been added. The rate of fire for the rocket turret was higher in the beta, using a rate of 5 rockets per second. In the final game, it was lowered to 3.5 rockets per second. Due to the rate of fire being so fast, the rockets don't have enough time to detonate before the next one hits any given surface, and some of the rockets are thrown off their trajectories and fly in random directions. Like in the final game, the rocket turret has the ability to lock onto air vehicles like the Banshee. However, the beta version of this turret has 3 distinct differences relating to this. The target acquiring time for the rocket turret was significantly longer in the beta, taking a whopping 3 seconds to lock onto an enemy vehicle. This was sped up considerably in the final game, with a 1.25 second timing. The red reticle range was also shorter in the beta, using only a 60 world unit range, while in the final game it was increased to 100 world units. The most significant difference, however, was the beta turret's ability to target track enemy ground vehicles. This feature was cut from the final variant, which can only track air units. One last difference to this turret was the inability to hijack it in the beta, most likely due to a lack of animations for it. Lastly, there's the Troop Transport Hog. The only notable difference with this Warthog variant is the inclusion of a 3rd passenger seat in the back, where the player hangs off of their roll cage using the Mongoose passenger animations. This seat is nowhere to be found in the final game, not even in the map files. Before we wrap up on vehicles, I'd like to briefly mention one more Warthog variant that wasn't in the beta map files, but appears in retail, the Destroyed variant. If you modify the Forge palette and spawn one in the map, it's essentially what you would expect it to be, a destroyed Warthog. This would have actually made for neat scenery pieces on Forge maps. Kind of a missed opportunity that this was never included in the Forge palette. With the inclusion of armor abilities, the fundamentals of the multiplayer maps in Halo Reach needed to change in order to accommodate them. There needed to be a greater deal of verticality on most maps to support the jetpack, and with players running with sprint and evade, pathways became longer so players can utilize them to the fullest. Halo Reach was also the first game in the series to implement physical map changes based on the game type being played, and some of these changes didn't make it to the final release. The maps included in the Halo Reach beta are Sword Base, Powerhouse, the Invasion map Boneyard, and the Network Test 1 map Overlook. To begin our map coverage, we'll start with Sword Base. The big difference that almost everyone who's played the beta remembers from this map is the overall aesthetic. In the final game, Sword Base has quite a few hallways that have environmental destruction, with walls being broken by explosives and gunfire, and tiles laying scattered all over the floors. In the beta, however, the map is much more pristine, as if battles never took place in this building at all. Also in the beta, there are various scenery pieces and other visual differences that didn't make it into the final game. One of these include flat screen monitors. 2 can be seated at the energy sword spawn, 1 in the computer room near the grav lift, and 1 in the room next to the green lift's exit point. Next are some static cameras stationed in various parts of the level. Lastly, there are these signs posted everywhere that are supposed to tell people to go to a certain direction. All 3 of these visual aspects were either removed or replaced in the final game. When looking outside of the window that overlooks the exterior area of Sword Base, there is a visual error in the far right corner. This is the part where I say it naturally got fixed in the final game, but when the geometry for the outside area was slightly altered, the errors somehow got worse and more noticeable in the retail version of Swordbase. One of the most notable features on the map that was exclusive to the beta was the inclusion of fences that blocked the exit points for both lifts when Capture the Flag was the chosen game type. This no longer happens by default when CTF is selected in the final game, and these fence pieces aren't present in the map files. But players can recreate this effect in Forge by designating a given object to only spawn in a certain game type. Finally, I'd like to go over the weapon placement changes. In the beta, the central bridge has a plasma launcher, and underneath the bridge in front of the Covey lift, there's a sniper rifle. In the final game, the default version of this map has a concussion rifle replace the plasma launcher, and the grenade launcher replaces the sniper. But matchmaking variants of this map has the sniper rifle retain its original beta location, and the grenade launcher sits where the beta plasma launcher did. Earlier in the video, I briefly talked about Forge mode, and I said there was a hidden room on Swordbase that could be accessed by utilizing the no-clip mode when a player picks up a weapon. Near the computer room, there's a door that can be clipped through, which reveals a mock-up of the room used for the last cutscene in the Oni Swordbase mission. It even has concept art for Dr. Halsey placed in here as a reference point. Normally, when performing this trick, the player instantly dies when trying to get into this room, so I had to set myself as invincible in order to walk around without dying. Unfortunately, there's no way to enter back into the main part of the level, so the player is forced to end the match. Our next map, which actually happens to be my favorite Halo Reach map, is Powerhouse. Out of all of the maps in the beta, it has the most visual changes, and they're all quite subtle. I'll start with the one everyone remembers the most, the shower room at grenade launcher spawn. In here, there are a couple of toilet seats, and in the shower itself, there's a few shower heads and faucets, as well as a few of these lights that are turned off. These were all removed in the final version of Powerhouse, but in the campaign mission Nightfall, where the player makes their way through this BSP, the shower room has toilet seats, shower heads, and faucets, but they all interestingly use different models than the ones seen in the beta. According to the map designer who developed Powerhouse, the reason these objects in the shower room were removed was due to the fact that players ended up getting stuck in their geometry during playtesting. While we're still in this building, there are two blank luminate boards that appear to have had something erased over. In the final game, these boards are written on in some kind of scheduling form. Also in this building are a bunch of posters that are plastered on the walls, and these are just about everywhere on the map. A common theme with these posters is that it's advertising for a cleaner environment, and this makes sense considering Powerhouse takes place on a hydroelectric plant. Next, we'll move on to this building. Like with the luminate boards in the previous building, the displays here change between the builds, with the final version showing what looks like schematics for the hydroelectric plant. This building also received various logos painted onto it in the final game, which are absent in the beta. A similar logo is planted onto the external part of the hammer spawn building in the final game as well. The water that surrounds this map is much clearer in the retail build. Outside of this house, there are two rolled up hoses attached to it. These were removed in the final game, but stayed there in the Nightfall BSP. Inside this house reveals a few containers sitting on top of these shelves, which are gone in the retail build. The last change in this house is this tiny yellow timer that sits in this one corner. It's gone in the final version of this map. One odd quirk about this map in the beta is an invisible wall jutting out of the gate near Shoddy spawn. This was removed in the final game. The final two Powerhouse changes are relating to two of the weapons and their placements on the map. First is the aforementioned shotgun spawn. Here is where it's located in the beta, but in final, it's slightly moved back and is now laying on a rock. The other rather odd change is the DMR. It's basically located in the same spot as it is in the final game, but instead of leaning on the structure, it's lying on the ground. Moving on from Powerhouse is Boneyard. And considering Boneyard is the only invasion map in the beta, I'm going to talk about the invasion differences between the two builds alongside the general map changes. The container that holds the core will always spawn in the beta no matter what game type is being played, but this will only appear when Invasion Boneyard is selected in the final game. This building also has different logos painted onto the exterior section in the beta, which would be replaced with various Synoviate logos later on. On the side of the docked frigate where the attackers spawn, the name of the ship, the Commonwealth, was plastered on the spot. In the final, however, the name was removed entirely. A rather peculiar change is this massive pile of wreckage in the beta, which completely vanishes in the final game. Also in the final game, there's an invisible barrier that spans from behind the core destination to all the way back to the starting area, but this was completely absent in the beta, and Banshee users can simply fly down this path to the main objective, away from a potential Scorpion user. Lastly, there are two glitch spots in the beta. One is near the starting area where a player can hop onto and walk on an invisible wall. Another is by the core destination, where a player can use a jetpack to fly all the way to this part of the cliffside and survive. Both of these were patched in retail, as the surfaces became too steep for a player to viably stand on them. Now, the following boneyard changes only happened during an invasion match, but I'm also going to briefly talk about the beta version of this game mode and how it differs from the retail variation. In the beta, invasion wasn't merely a red versus blue game type like it is today. Instead, it was essentially a green versus purple game mode. Each team is segmented by 3 fire teams, A, B, and C, and each fire team provides a different shade of either green or purple depending on the team. This was most likely changed to a red versus blue game mode because in the beta, invasion only played for 1 round, which meant that players didn't swap over to the opposing side when the round was over. Each hill-based objective in the beta had these small terminals attached to them, and the first 2 objectives on Boneyard had animated lights that would spin when one of the hills are being captured. Both of these visual aspects were removed from the final game. Another odd quirk about these first 2 hills are the alert sound effects used for capturing them. Between the 2 builds, these sounds swapped places in the final game. If the Spartan managed to hold off the elites from securing the first set of objectives, a few things exclusive to the beta will happen. 1, the announcer will say the elites got skunked. This voice line is used in the final game, but not on Boneyard specifically. This line will only be played on Forge maps. The other thing that'll happen is that after the longswords fly overhead, fusion coils will spawn on top of and detonate any surviving elites, almost as if the longswords just bombed them. The fusion coils won't appear in retail and elites will survive. After capturing the first objective, 2 of one of the most notable differences in this build of invasion will spawn. These Covenant themed weapon holders will spawn for the elites, one to the far left and the other to the far right, and both will contain a focus rifle and a plasma launcher. However, this Covenant weapon holder no longer exists in the final game, not even in the map files, and the weapons will simply spawn on the floor and a little closer to the next objective. This time though, instead of 2 focus rifles and 2 plasma launchers in Phase 2, only 1 of each will spawn, and another pair will spawn alongside them in Phase 3. The next 2 objectives for Phase 2 have 2 distinct differences between the beta and final. One is that the required amount of time needed to capture one of these hills needs 10 extra seconds in the beta, which equal to 30 seconds, whereas the final version only needs 20. The hill inside of the base next to the core spawn was also marginally larger than the beta, with the extension caused by the small invasion terminal as mentioned previously. With it gone in retail, the hill becomes slightly smaller and offered less cover. As for the Spartan side, the amount of power weapons that they receive in Phase 2 was absolutely insane. 2 rocket launchers, 2 sniper rifles, a Spartan laser, and a DMR. The weapon selection in this phase was considerably nerfed in the final release, with the Spartans getting 1 rocket launcher, 1 sniper rifle, and 1 shotgun. I also like to mention 2 extra factors about these beta weapon spawns. For one thing, these weapons are actually spawned into the map on startup as seen by the timing of this theater film. The other thing is related to the green weapon holders that they're attached to. They're actually not in the final game at all and only exist in the beta, and in the retail build, the weapons lean against the wall as they spawn. In Phase 3, the human side gets another sniper rifle, rocket launcher, and Spartan laser in the small house next to the core destination. Nothing spawns here in the final game, and the humans only get a Spartan laser in the main building. Finally, moving on from Boneyard, we have Overlook. This map has the least amount of visual differences, but where the big change lies is the role this map played during the beta. Overlook served as a testing ground for Halo Reach's firefight component when it came to the online multiplayer connection, hence why the game mode used for this map, Generator Defense, was called Network Test 1 in the beta. As for Generator Defense itself, not much is fundamentally different about this version of the game type compared to the final game other than the lack of AI and the inclusion of 2 more players. There is an odd visual glitch when it comes to the Spartan colors though. As you can see, I have set specific colors for these 3 Spartans. However, when the game starts, they are given a completely different set of armor colors. Each time a Spartan respawns into a different spawning area, the armor will generate new colors, and anyone else who happens to spawn in that same area will inherit the same colors. As for the map itself, here are the few differences that I managed to find. The color of the fog used on this map is a much more defined blue in the beta, where it becomes grayish in retail. Near the turret spawn, there are these haystacks that are placed upright in the beta, but have been turned over onto their side in the final game. In the interior section, there are pools of blood that litter the floor near the ammo resupply case, which was oddly removed in the retail version. The fences use a different set of textures between the 2 builds. The change that hurt me the most was the exclusion of this one rainbow that periodically spawns over the waterfall in the beta version of this map. Sadly, it was removed in the final game. There's a radio that spawns in the room behind the ammo case that transmits various conversations between two background UNSC characters, Dragon X-Ray and Blue Delta.
Blue Delta, this is Dragon X-Ray. We are on the ground and 3 mics out from the objective, over.
Dragon X-Ray, be advised that you are the only UNSC ground asset in that grid.
This set of dialogue would be replaced with a different set featuring civilians instead.
Do you think it was UNSC goons? Like, maybe they found out the URF was running a pirate station out of the business area?
If that's the case, why blame the outage on the game's success? Why not apologize for a temporary outage and play up the futility of resistance?
The intriguing thing about the beta dialogue set for this map is that it actually ended up being relocated to the radio final courtyard of the final game. Only this time, it features new voice actors.
Blue Delta, this is Dragon X-Ray. We are on the ground at 3 mics out from the objective, over.
Dragon X-Ray, be advised that you are the only UNSC ground asset in that grid. Over.
Blue Delta, this is Dragon X-Ray. We are on the ground at 3 mics out from the objective, over.
Dragon X-Ray, be advised that you are the only UNSC ground asset in that grid.
Our next chapter covers one of the new mechanics introduced to Halo Reach that would become a standard feature for the rest of the series, Assassinations. In terms of functionality, it's the same in the beta as it is in the rest of the series. The player runs up to an enemy's back, holds the melee button, and the animation plays. However, there are quite a few differences in both the visuals and the types of animations used between the two builds. In the beta, when the blade makes contact with the victim's body, the shield doesn't break, and the players don't make any sounds during the animation. In Retail, the shields break when the blade makes contact to the body, and the characters will make overzealous sound effects as the animation is played out. The Retail product also includes a medal for Assassinations, which wasn't used in the beta. Humorously, it was possible to assassinate teammates in the beta. This is no longer possible in the final game. I'd also like to briefly mention the different types of assassinations a player can achieve depending on how they approach their victims. In the beta, there's ground, air to ground, and air assassinations. In the final game, 2 more variations have been added, and these are slightly above ground versus ground and energy sword assassinations. Another big change that the final build makes to Assassinations, which really only applies to the ground versus ground type, are extra animations based on where the held melee is striking the back. And these areas include the left side of the back, center of the back, right side of the back, and the right shoulder. This was not in the beta, and only one animation for the ground assassination type will play. There are 2 specific assassination animations I'd like to talk about in the beta. The first one is the ground type Spartan vs Spartan, where the player ducks underneath its victim and quickly stabs the opponent in the back. This animation exists in the final game, but it takes slightly longer to perform with the animation dragging out the initial stabbing motion. The other animation is the air to ground elite vs elite assassination. The animation used in the beta goes unused in the final game. Here, the elite spins his victim around, then stabs the opponent directly in the mouth. In the final game, this was replaced with a new animation where the attacker stabs the opponent twice with both of his energy blades before tossing the victim aside. Our last chapter for this video dedicating to the beta specifically will be on other miscellaneous finds that I couldn't group into the previous chapters. We'll start by going over various visual differences between the 2 builds. I'd like to start with split screen. It's no secret that when a game is in split screen mode, the visuals downscale overall in order to keep a consistent frame rate. The example we'll be using today is the quality of the elite models. In the beta, they're surprisingly not that far off with how they visually appear in single player mode. However, they were hit drastically in Retail. The mandibles are missing their guards, and their teeth are just straight up gone. Meanwhile, their eyes have also vanished. Medals have a much grittier appearance overall in the beta, whereas the final game counterparts are much cleaner and resemble the ones used in Halo 3. The Opportunist medal is rewarded when a player kills an enemy that's in the middle of a reload. It ended up being replaced with the Reload This medal in the Retail build. The Close Call emblem in particular has a corresponding line of announcer dialogue in the beta,
Close call.
but for whatever reason, it was cut from the Retail variant.
Alpha under attack.
The elites in the beta went through a few visual changes between the beta and Retail builds. One of the more striking features of the beta elites are their cold, dead eyes, which lack irises and pupils. Their team armor colors are much darker in the beta. using a darker shade of red or blue while using a secondary black coloring. Their armors also gave off a teal blue shine to it while looking at it from certain angles, with it even being visible on the red team color scheme. Elites in the final game used a much more defined red and blue primary and secondary color when issued to teams, and their eyes are solid black. Spartans, on the other hand, have a noticeable difference located on their forearms. There's actually a camo pattern painted there, and it's best seen with a dark green color. It even appears in the first person animations. While Oddball and Capture the Flag were included in the original run for this beta, the elites never had a chance to hold these objects as there weren't elite variants of these game types. Surprisingly enough, they have complete animations for these objectives. An objective that goes unused in the beta entirely is the Assault Bomb, which still appears in the map files despite never going used in the beta's matchmaking playlists. Next, there's a bunch of unused armor permutations for both the Spartans and the elites. However, for Spartans, I'm only going to be covering the helmets unless I need to mention anything else in the armor set. There's actually a fourth helmet slot after military police. The EVA-C helmet, or in this case Emil's signature helmet, was supposedly meant to be a teaser for players as they waited for the final game to release, and this is what it would have looked like during the beta. As for the rest of the armor permutations, we'll start with the elites. The officer armor is mostly the same as it is in the retail release, but the light that shines on the top of the helmet is a bluish color, which changes to an orange red later on. The Ultra is similar to the final counterpart as well, but the coloring on the faceplate is a much darker reddish gray in the beta compared to the final where it's a lighter gray. The general elite's armor textures are incomplete, but the overall design plan is the same as finals. The Elite Zealot is in the files as well, but its armor hasn't been implemented into the game just yet, and the biped spawns as an unarmored elite. The infamous Bob Elite still uses the Ranger armor variant, but the armor color is a hot pink instead of the yellow-orange color that I would eventually wear in the retail build. The only elite armor set that isn't in the beta files at all is the Field Marshal. Next up are the Spartan bipeds. All of Noble Team except for George is included in the beta files. June's armor is mostly the same as the final builds, but his right shoulder has an extra sniper belt attachment, which forces his knife to clip through it. Emil's next, and the skull carving on his visor has an extra layer of black spray paint underneath. Now we have Kat, and there's a few obvious differences with her armor set. Her air assault helmet is incomplete, with the visor being completely transparent, and some parts of the helmet are untextured. The part of her undersuit that takes up her right shoulder is pitch black in the beta, and changes to a more visually noticeable gray in the final. The last Noble Team member is the knifeless variant of Emil, and while I wouldn't normally bring this variant up considering both Emils are almost one and the same outside of the lack of knife, the beta version of knifeless Emil has a brighter red color security shoulder than the standard version. This was corrected in the final game. Moving away from whole bipeds, we'll talk about the unused helmets that are hidden in the beta files. Almost all of the helmet variants are in the beta files with the exception of the Halo 1 style Mark V, the JFO, the Security, the Recon, the Pilot, and the Haunted variant. The EOD, CQB, and Gungnir helmets have the same design plans, but are entirely untextured. The EVA helmet is lacking a visor texture. Finally, the Grenadier helmet by default uses a similar visor color to that of George from Noble Team. The last bit of beta content that we'll be covering today are a set of unused animations that aren't seen at all in the final game. This one is called M35 Intro C. According to the animation's name, this was most likely intended to appear during an introductory segment of the Tip of the Spear mission, as the name M35 is a codename for that level. It's missing quite a few keyframes throughout the animation, hence why it appears jagged in motion. The next two animations are related to a cut elite assassination versus a Gouda. One is for a successful kill. The other is for a failed attempt. An interesting bit of trivia related to this cut Gouda assassination is that the elite version of this is only found in the beta files, whereas the Spartan version only appears in the final game's files. The last animation is called Use Health Station, and it's depicting a Spartan injecting itself with something, probably a syringe. This could imply that instead of health packs, maps would have had designated health stations similar to those of the Optican first aid stations in ODST. To wrap up this extremely long beta analysis for Halo Reach, I like to briefly mention a few screen caps of other builds of the game, which contain their own bits of unused content. Here we have this pre-alpha screenshot of Halo Reach, and there's a lot to uncover here. The color of the HUD is a dark yellow, which happens to be similar to Halo 3 ODST's HUD color. The assault rifle uses an ammo counter that's almost an exact replica of Halo 3's, most likely as a placeholder during this stage of development. Also, for whatever reason, the AR's crosshairs were shifted way too far to the left. Whether this was a visual glitch or some other unknown cut feature is unclear. Lastly, there's the armor ability icon for Sprint, which is a lightning bolt in this build of Reach. You can actually see this being used up in the Once More Unto the Breach vidoc. This next screenshot shows the pause menu during a campaign mission. While it has a bunch of placeholder text, the main area of focus is the privacy option. It looks like campaign missions were originally going to allow other players to join a campaign session already in progress, but this was cut from the final game. This one shows an early build of Oni's sword base. What's interesting about the DMR in the player's hands is that the numbers plate is blue in this screenshot, much like how it is in the final game. Finding how this goes blue, to the beta sage green, to once again being blue in the retail version. There was also going to be an extra AA gun present in the opening segment of Oni's sword base, but this was removed later on. This screenshot shows that a rocket Warthog was going to show up 2 missions earlier than where it appears in the final game, tip of the spear. Lastly, the Spartan laser was going to appear in Oni's sword base as well. What's interesting is that the Spartan laser still resides in the files for the final version of this map, and I was able to recreate the scene depicted in that alpha screenshot. There was also a Halo Reach pre-beta, which was essentially an internal test to prepare for the public beta. Everything is basically the same in this build, but the one and only difference between this build and the public beta is where the nameplates are located on a player's gamertag. In the pre-beta, the nameplates are positioned all the way down to the right of the gamertag, but in the public beta, they were moved a bit to the left. To top it all off, we have to pay our respects to our dear friends Borky the Porcupine and the Space Squirrel, 2 animals that never made it to the retail build of Halo Reach. Critters never die, they're just going to get some food. And that's that for our Halo Reach beta analysis. Kudos to everyone who made it this far. I know this was a hefty video. If, and only if, you enjoyed this content, hit the like button and subscribe for more Halo content on this channel, and make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload a new video. Make sure to follow me on Twitch, my Twitter, and join my Discord server as well. This is the Vengeful Vadam, and I'll see you on the great journey.